So there is obviously the nutritional side of food, right? That you need to get food in order to be able to survive. But everything else outside of maybe farming techniques and outside of how the body uses that nutrition is cultural. For example, who you eat with, who prepares the food, who cleans up the food, who gets the first choice of food, what kinds of food do you even eat? I don't eat horse, I don't eat snake or frogs, but for some people and in some cultures, some of those foods would be the norm. So my point is that pretty much everything outside of just the fact that my body needs food is in some way or another shaped by culture and our expectations. Take our US culture, right? How many times have you eaten in the car on the run? And in other countries, that would just be horrible thing to do. Like, you're supposed to eat a meal over several hours and savor each portion of that meal. So that's it, with a group of people, right? You're savoring it with a group. The idea of the importance of a family dinner in the United States, there's been research that's done that shows that families that eat together stay together. And one of my favorite examples of this is that the word companion has the same root as the word for bread in Latin. So pan, which is the French and somehow connected to Latin root of that word, is found in companion. So the idea there is that sharing bread is a very intimate activity. And so when you take time to share your food, you are creating community in essence. Now that can be true across the board, but certainly there are those cultures where that's still very valued to be able to share that. And I think that for some Americans, there's still an importance on doing that, whether or not our lifestyle really allows for that or not. I know, for example, that most of us, our activities usually revolve around food. When we think about who are we going to get together with and when are we going to do it, it's often around either getting drinks or getting food of some sort. So we still find ways of socializing and combining that together. We also talk about places that are called third space. In other words, we have home and we have work, and then we have the places that are the bars and the coffee houses, right? These are our third space places where we come together to commune over some sort of beverage or food source. One of the challenges that we have in the United States is we overconsume food. We are given multiple images. We are told that to be popular, famous, sexy, you have to have a certain body image. But we're also told that you can have it your way and that you can go pick up your food at midnight because the drive-thru's open, and you deserve this, and you're wasting your money if you don't supersize this, right? It's such a good bargain. So you got to eat more and you got to get to this buffet. So we really send mixed messages. There is an argument that we in the US, again, just sort of in general terms, have high levels of malnutrition. We still get a lot of calories, so we don't look like the starving child that you see on that TV commercial for that public service announcement, rather. But we're getting the wrong kinds of calories, and that creates other kinds of deficits within our health. And eating disorders, things like bulimia and anorexia, are very uncommon in developing countries. In part because they don't have this overconsumption of food habit, but they also don't have these mixed messages over here about how your body's supposed to look. They're not spending as much time in front of television and the movies and being told that this is the standard for what you should be to be popular. Huge effect of how the colonial countries impact the local colonies. Now, and it varies to some extent, because places like East Africa, where I mentioned there was a huge British population that settled there, or of course in Brazil, where you've got a huge Portuguese settlement, you've got huge African settlement that helped to found Brazil in addition to the native populations there. When those settlements happen, then they bring their food traditions, and they're more likely to stick than when you just have a colonial outpost and a few people that are there. So for example, in Cameroon, you've got, when I was there, you had French bread that was, and croissants was a common breakfast staple, harking back to the French. Ghana, it would be 110 degrees outside, and people would still have their hot tea in the afternoon. Which, being from the South, I just, had trouble with where's my sweet tea? But But yeah, so those food traditions really go back and forth in some really fascinating ways. There's a fabulous book I use in my class about the country of Belize. And that was a former British colony as well. And you can find examples just like this all over the place. But they are a fairly new country in terms of gaining their independence, and how they gain their national identity and their sense of a national cuisine kind of parallels, right? As they were creating this separation from Britain and what makes us different from the British, you go through this history where it was really important to have imports, because that showed a certain amount of status, if you could afford to have those canned foods. And then you get to this point where no, it's like, well, what's locally grown here and what's indigenous even to this area? Because obviously a lot of crops are grown there now that were originally introduced into the area. So it's fascinating, and that's the second half of my class, is really dealing with identity as it relates to food, whether it's national identity, religious identity, regional identity, even within places like the US, and thinking about how we use food as part of identifying ourselves and our communities. Belize is another example where rice and beans is also very popular. I mean, it's popular throughout much of Latin America as well as even parts of the Caribbean, but it's interesting because they don't grow rice or beans in Belize. And so, but eventually at some point it becomes adopted as like the national cuisine of the area. So part of what happens there is that there are foods that may be introduced to the area, but people begin, they like the taste. Maybe it's filling. I mean, rice is a very popular food source because it's fairly cheap to grow, but it also fills you up as a starchy commodity. It fills you up. So you need that energy. And the beans also help with that, with the protein and so forth. So it's an accessible food. It is a filling sort of food, and it becomes very popular. Why do people like some of the things that we consume in our country? Like, I don't know, take Coca-Cola. I mean, that's a fascinating topic too, because it has no nutritional value whatsoever, and yet it takes on this symbol, even globally. It has a symbol of being associated with the United States. It's like there's the American flag and then there's Coca-Cola in terms of an unintentional emblem of the United States. And again, people may like the taste, people may need the caffeine, but it's not necessarily nutritional value in that case that creates a certain popularity. Products like that, like the Hershey candy bar, if I'm not mistaken, was put in packages in World War II with the rations of the soldiers, and it helped to popularize that drink and some of those foods beyond just the South, or just in the regions that they had been produced in. And then you end up with these global phenomenon. I would say do your research in terms of knowing what the popular foods are in the area. One of the neat things about the Olympics, obviously, is that you're going to have an international community descending in these locations. So you're probably going to get a very globalized market in terms of food. So it's not just Brazilian food you're going to have access to, but it's some pretty authentic foods from, and authentic's kind of a questionable word to use, but you're going to have some food that is popular in other countries as well. So I think it'd be very exciting. It'd be a playground for your taste buds to be able to go and kind of sample places from all over the world. But in terms of taking advantage of Brazil, usually their daily meal schedule is a little bit different than the US. I understand that the bigger meal is earlier in the day and the smaller meal is at night, whereas for traditionally in America, we would have the smaller meal at lunch and the bigger meal at the evening time. So depending on one's Olympic schedule, right, what event they're going to, they may or may not be able to take advantage of having a long sit-down meal in the middle of the day. But if it works out for one's schedule, it could be a real advantage to try to have that experience in addition to sampling the food, but having sort of the whole experience at a particular restaurant.